Good morning and welcome. Before anything else, I want to thank my colleague Richard Tuck, who has so generously given us his guidance right through this process of putting together the conference. Richard, thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure working with you and indeed working through you with Hobbes, amongst others. But it has been really a splendid opportunity to work with Richard, and I hope we're going to do many other things in collaboration with Richard. If anybody has outstayed his welcome, it has got to be me. This is the third time in the span of a day that I have welcomed you to, in our time, the Great War at 100. Before handing over to President Drew Faust for her introductory remarks, I want very briefly to reflect on the Mahindra Center's long-standing interest in the humanities and violence. From our Age of Terror series to the Art of Survival, our commemoration of the 10th anniversary of 9/11, from our conference on mass incarceration to recent talks by Elaine Scarry on thermonuclear monarchy, Rashid Khalidi on the unhealed wounds of World War I in Armenia, Kurdistan, and Palestine, Etienne Balibar on violence, civility, and politics, and Partha Chatterjee on international law and the pedagogy of violence, the Mahindra Center has explored violence from a wide range of disciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives. This year, with the generous support of the Mellon Foundation, we have launched a 3-year university-wide seminar on violence and nonviolence. On March the 30th, I hope you'll join us for our conference on asymmetric war with a keynote by Jeremy Waldron. The germ of these programs came to me as a result of reading the post-genocide testimony of Jean-Baptiste Maniacore, a teacher of the humanities in the Nyamata region of Rwanda. And I'm doing some work on Rwanda, and in particular on the importance given in Rwanda to what the Rwandan Truth and Reconciliation Commission called the importance of the rhetorical factor. They actually, in their report, use the rhetorical factor as being as serious as any other breach of rights and responsibilities by the state. The rhetorical factor in the mode and moment of violence. This is what Jean-Baptiste Maniacore had to say, and it had a profound influence on me. What happened in Nyamata, in the churches, in the marshes and the hills, are the supernatural doings of ordinary people. He'd obviously read his Arendt. The headmaster and the school inspector struck blows with their own hands. A priest, the magistrate, the assistant chief of police, a doctor, killed with their own hands. These learned people were calm, and they rolled up their sleeves to get a firm grip on a machete. So for people like me, who have taught the humanities their life long, criminals such as these are a terrible mystery. Maniacore's cri de coeur takes its place alongside Adorno's question, can there be poetry after Auschwitz? And a verse from Auden's Sonnets from China, based on his experience of the rape of Nanking. Yet ideas can be true, although men die. For we have seen a myriad faces ecstatic from one lie, and maps can really point to places where evil is now Nanking, Dachau. And somewhere behind and beyond these iconic instances of inhumanity, a question for humanists and the humanities formulated by Hannah Arendt in a late essay she dedicated to W.H. Auden. The question that imposed itself was, she writes, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining and reflecting upon whatever happens to come to pass, regardless of specific content and quite independent of results, could this activity be of such a nature that it conditions men against evildoing? I do not intend this morning to work with this collage of quotations. I have written about them at some length elsewhere. Here I want simply to suggest that even as Munyacore and Auden speak of the extinction of the spirit of humanism, we learn from them what the humanities at their best can do in the service of humanity. For the humanities impose upon us an ongoing ethical responsibility that accompanies each moment in the process of thinking, doing, and making. The humanities introduce a different temporality to the act of learning and judging. We cannot postpone our moral reflections to the alchemy or teleology of end results. We don't say, now that our experiment has provided the appropriate information or result, now that the argument has more or less worked out, now is the time to begin to reflect on moral implications and ethical underpinnings. The humanities cannot and does not play the waiting game, and history will not allow it. For us, each imminent, disclosing moment in the midst of transition, in the agony of the incomplete, each tentative moment demands the choice of meanings and morals. Munyakore's slow-motion depiction of the caring professions deliberately taking up their machetes is an illustration of the failure, the forgetting of this obligation to reflect minute by minute. If only they had taken the ethical time to think and reflect while acting. And that is, I think, what Arendt means when she talks about the humanistic habit of examining and reflecting upon what happens to come to pass, independent of content and results. This, friends, I believe, is the habit of the humanities. The work of the humanities, historical, philological, philosophical, poetic, provides an exemplary education because it shows us what it means to live and to think on the knife edge of civility and barbarism. The agony of the humanities, in the full productive sense of the phrase, lies in learning to examine and reflect, to create and to critique in the knowledge that the knife edge cuts both ways at once. Such is, in my view, the concluding wisdom of President Faust's Bancroft lecture, The Civil War, the Great War, and the Meaning of the 20th Century, recently delivered in Cambridge, England. Let me quote from her, even as I hand over to her. Humans had, in one sense, become cogs in the machinery of an increasingly industrialized warfare, yet they were at the same time newly citizens and selves with bodies and names that had rights in life and in death. We still live amidst these contradictions and these ironies. We still struggle with the challenges to belief and meaning that these wars represented. We still seek to understand what it might have been like to be one of those who fought or those who died. Welcome, Drew Faust.
Thank you so much, Homi. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you and to thank you for being part of this exploration of World War I and its relevance to our own time. I'm not a scholar of that war, but its history has always intrigued me and has very much shaped the questions I've posed in my own work on the Civil War. It's an honor to be in the presence of scholars who've had such a powerful influence on our understanding of those critical years just a century ago. What was World War I, and why does it matter? We will hear many answers to that question in the day ahead. Some may be very immediate and specific in their implications. For example, I think of how we have all been so powerfully reminded recently of the lingering force of the national boundaries drawn in the Middle East by the victors in that war. But we can also make broader and more general claims for the war's continuing importance. Those who have written about the Great War in the 100 years since it began, and indeed those so deeply involved in commemorating it today, have frequently seen it as even the defining event of the 20th century and of modernity more broadly. And their characterization of this determinative influence has been far from an admiring one. George Kennan described the war as the great seminal catastrophe of the century, one that sowed the seeds not just of World War II, but of communism, Nazism, the Holocaust, and the Gulag. It was, in the words of other analysts and scholars, and I'll quote a few, a historical watershed, iconic, a symbol of the catastrophic character of the 20th century as a whole. It brought a novel type of warfare. The Western world's entire relationship to war was permanently and drastically altered. Wyndham Lewis, British writer, painter, and artillery officer, proclaimed the war to be the turning point in the history of the earth. As one prominent historian put it just this year, it was the greatest black swan event in world history, an event both unimaginable and transformative. The Great War introduced a level of brutality and revealed a capacity for human cruelty that has shaped our lives ever since. Particularly in Europe, where its impact was felt so powerfully, World War I is seen to have introduced a rupture into the history of war and the history of human experience. A rupture that is fundamental to who we are today, a full century after those fateful August guns began to sound. Henry James was horrified by the outbreak of this war. He could remember an earlier conflict. He was 20 and had just finished a year's study at Harvard Law School when his younger brother was grievously wounded in the American Civil War. The acclaimed novelist was 71 when the Great War began. Having long since abandoned the United States for London, he at last became a naturalized British subject as an expression of war-born patriotism. But he regarded the conflict, as he put it, as an abyss of blood and darkness, a challenge to the most fundamental assumptions of what he called the whole long age during which we have supposed the world to be gradually bettering. James had invested his life and his work in the notion of human progress and civilization, of improvement and of lessons learned since the Civil War had exerted its devastating effects on his brother Wilkie. But James, like so many others, was compelled by the Great War to recognize, as he put it, that reality is a world capable of this. War imposed on his life a changed meaning. He died in February 1916. The war outlasted him. Reality is a world capable of this. The war was astounding to James and to many others of his time. In many ways, it remains astounding to us still. The opportunity to explore its reality with these distinguished historians and scholars will be a great privilege. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Martha Minow. I'm the dean at the Harvard Law School, and I am struck by this event as the effects of the Great War continue in our world today in ways that I think we still don't fully understand, and yet we're here to find new ways of understanding it. I'm particularly honored to be part of this panel whose participants are not only distinguished scholars, but each reminds us what it means to have a global perspective. And I just will share briefly George Orwell's comment, "People sleep peaceably in their beds at night because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf." Compared with Bayard Rustin's comment, "If we desire a society of peace, we cannot achieve such a society through violence." And then prompted by Homey's comment about the humanities and reflection, Leonardo da Vinci said, "I love those who can smile during difficult times, who find strength through distress, and who find great bravery in reflection." So I look forward to the brave reflections here. We will start with Professor Leila Fawaz, who is the Issam Fares Professor of Lebanese and Eastern Mediterranean Studies at Tufts University. She was named a Chevalier in the French National Order of the Legion of Honor, one of her many distinguished awards. That's France's highest award, reflecting the extraordinary work that she has done as a scholar. That work includes her very important books, including Transformed Landscapes, Essays on Palestine and the East. And I cannot help but also acknowledge her tremendous service to Harvard on the Board of Overseers and as the President of the Board of Overseers. So let's start with Leila.
Thank you. Thank you, Martha. Generous as always. I'm grateful to Homi Bhabha for his warmth, generosity, and creative leadership of the Mahindra Center and for organizing and hosting this conference. I would also like to thank Drew Faust, along with Homi, for their wonderful opening remarks, and Margaret Macmillan for her masterful keynote lecture. The Great War transformed the Middle East, bringing to an end hundreds of years of Ottoman rule in the Arab lands, while giving rise to the Middle East as we know it today. After the war, extensive areas of the former Ottoman Syrian provinces, also known as Greater Syria, which included most of the Levant, were carved up into mandated territories to be ruled by colonial powers, France and Britain. The forces of anti-colonialism in the area would have many more battles to fight before they could be free from European domination. In addition to redrawing the political map of the Middle East, World War I altered the everyday lives of the peoples of the region and began a long process of reshaping identities. In our media here, the issue of identity in the Middle East is regularly presented as one of religious hatreds that date back to time immemorial. In reality, there is not one individual reason for how we got where we are. There are several. There is the drawing of borders for a future Middle East, which is now getting media attention thanks to ISIS and Sykes-Picot. Important were also the numerous strategies over our long 20th century to prolong old divisions and create new ones, divide and rule the region, as different states have used different strategies to impose their vision and will on their populations and, in as much as they can, on their neighbors. We also know that the eruption of violence can be tied to socio-economic issues. We have seen people of different sects help one another in times of crisis. and people of the same sects take different positions in times of conflict based on an economic need and differences. There are also the more nuanced and long-term collective effects of the war on society. Cynicism was one outcome of the Great War I wanted to mention. The promises by the Allies to respect and support national aspirations took second place to realpolitik, and the peoples of the Middle East learned the hard way not to trust any ruler's promises. Cynicism in small doses can be useful in politics, but the massive disappointment felt after the outcome of World War I led to a depth of distrust in government, local or foreign, that did not bode well for the rest of the century. Also, experience with war left its mark on the populations. On the eve of World War I, people in Europe had gotten used to peace, as Margaret Macmillan put it yesterday. On the eve of World War I, in contrast, the people of the Middle East had already been exhausted by wars, including civil wars, by conscription, by years and even decades of service in the army away from home, often not making it possible to ever return home, and by their families surviving by their wits and with few resources and income. In fact, before even the First World War began, as mentioned yesterday, the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had so exhausted those who were conscripted that when the First World War started, many did not realize the break between the Balkan Wars and the First World War, and saw it all as one continuum of conflict and forced conscription. The Ottoman Empire was at war almost continuously from the beginning of the Italian-Turkish War in 1911 through the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, and then the First World War from 1914 to 18, and then wars such as the Turkish War for Independence ending in 1922. Then, when the First World War began, most did not see or write about war as a worthy, noble cause. I saw recently The American Sniper and wondered how far that was from the things I read. To the people of the region, there was no great war, noble war. There were many small, separate wars. People lived the war as a series of small wars. It is only decades after that the memory of the war evolved and began to be described as a great war of suffering that is called Safar Barlik, or mobilization, and the great ordeal of barefoot soldiers, as they were called, crossing cities, deserts, whole regions away from home, as well as the great ordeal of starving civilians facing famine, locust, disease, uprooting, dislocation, and levels of misery so profound and so lasting that the memory of it was passed on from generation to the other. In the West, the war hardened and solidified already formed national identities. In the East, the war shattered the imperial Ottoman system that, for all its faults and for much of the time, allowed a multiplicity of identities to coexist. The losses were staggering, as the war did not only destroy armies, it destroyed societies and economies. In this way, the experience of World War I in the Middle East is perhaps more akin to the experience of World War II in Europe. The social, economic, psychological effects were deep and devastating. It ravaged the land. The experience of the war was immensely damaging, not only for conscripts and other soldiers, but also for civilians. It has been estimated that the countries of the Middle East suffered more proportionately than any other belligerents. In Greater Syria, estimates put casualties conservatively at around 500,000. This is not to diminish the social disruption and suffering experienced in the West. They were immense. It is imprudent to weigh the balance of human misery in equivalent measures. The point, rather, is that the experience and memory of the war were altogether different. Many of those who actually fought the war did not remain in the Middle East. Many of the Indians who fought at Kut in Mesopotamia returned to India. Many of the British forces under Allenby that drove across the Sinai and up to Damascus via Palestine, with the Arab irregulars on their flank, outpacing them and keeping the Ottoman army off balance and on the defensive, went back to Britain. Many of the Germans that supported and advised the Ottoman allies returned to Germany. But the local populations, returning recruits and civilians who survived the war, stayed closer to home, and in staying, they were the main keepers of the memory. Yet, learning about the past or remembering it properly is difficult at all times. On one level, there is the private nature of memory. We cannot remember what we did not experience. So in looking at how memories of the war shaped identity in Greater Syria, it is important to understand its private, personal characteristic, but it also had a public, more broad-based nature. The civilian experiences of the war varied across a wide range, from those who lost everything to the war profiteers who made fortunes, from Ottoman pashas trying to stay in control, to those who became known as martyrs, hanged in 1915 and 1916 in Beirut, Damascus, Palestine, because they were accused of collaborating against the Ottoman rulers on the side of the Entente enemy. The civilian experiences of the Great War also included the men who died, the refugees who did not survive long marches deprived of the most basic necessities, the women and children who were exploited, or those who found opportunities for some autonomy in villages that previously were controlled by husbands, brothers, and fathers. In one way or another, a vast majority of the people simply endured. Among them were also those who worked hard to start businesses, little entrepreneurs. But then they had to move their families around after the outbreak of war and even at the conclusion of war. Refugees are a huge part of the story. The transnational aspect of the work of Professor Winter is part of the flow of populations and migrations that globalized the Middle East, an impetus for regional interaction that left the Middle East very interesting afterwards. On another level, there is a broader, more public nature to memory in how memory is used to reshape and rewrite the past at the group, official, national, and collective level. It is something nations and their national figures try to do. Those who were in power at the time of great conflicts and survived them rewrite the history of the war as they do elsewhere to drive their particular points home, to justify the failure of some leaders to rise above parties, or the failure of others to put their interests below those of their nations or peoples, and to give themselves glorified roles at stressful times. In this context, it is sometimes easy to look for heroes. It's sometimes difficult to look for heroes in the Middle East. I searched for heroes while writing my book on World War I, but ended up admiring the common people and not their political leaders. There are statues everywhere of leaders, but really, are they heroes? It is something for future students to decide on. I certainly made up my mind. Ordinary men and women often survived with dignity and courage. But it was harder to find leaders who were fighting the broader causes and ideologies rather than their own interest. With time, say by the middle of the 20th century, some of these leaders or politicians wrote memoirs in which they gave themselves important war roles in the Great War. Some political figures were, of course, justified to do so, but not always. Less studied, and to some of us more deserving, were the ordinary folks who survived war and had no reason to embellish how they lived or how they remembered it. There is simplicity in their depiction of the war and its remembrance. What do we make of the gap between what people tell us happened and what probably happened? It's an important question because it is important to get clarity about what happened in the past, the violent past, and make it possible for the younger generations to expect accountability. The absence of accountability is dramatic in the Middle East, and it is essential in shaping the future. Learning about the past or remembering it properly is difficult at all times for everyone, but not explaining the past clearly confuses the present. How war is lived and invoked was brought to my attention recently in a small anecdote. In the fall this year, I was in Beirut spending an evening with my family when my niece commented that she wished she could find a good and balanced account on the Lebanese civil war of 1975 to 1990 to learn about the war and tell her children about it. My niece is now 45 years old. She was 7 in 1975 when the war began and 22 when it ended. And she spent many of those years in Europe and in the Arab world outside Lebanon, which was being torn apart. She said that she is surprised that many of the same politicians people talked about now during the politics of today were being talked about during the civil war of the 70s and 80s and 90s, that they still dominate the political life of Beirut. She is surprised too that this important civil war is not covered properly in her children's textbooks, that there is no official history that is agreed upon by all the sects, all the groups, no private collections that one can trust to explain the war to her generation and that of her children. This lack of impartiality in the recollections of the war confuses her. She wishes somebody could tell her who did what and how and why, at least in a more objective way than it is now. This is an example of the smallest level of the relationship between memory and war, how people lived it and tried to remember it. So what do we make of the gap between what people tell us happened and what probably happened? Again, personal anecdotes bring out the contradictions between what we hear and what may be true. One of the most disliked figures of World War I in the Middle East was an Ottoman military governor called Jamal Pasha. He made Muslims, Christians, and other communities suffer with his policies during the war. Today, several historians have begun to paint Jamal Pasha in a more positive term, defending his motivations and actions, because historians do that. They rewrite history and reinterpret the past. But from the perspective of most of those living under his rule, who left memoirs or passed it on orally to their families, he was the one to blame the most for much of the misery endured during the war. There was local unanimity in calling him a tyrant, a bloodshedder, an oppressor. One of the few unifying memories of the war, in fact, comes from this local criticism of Jamal Pasha by members of different religious sects. The dislike for him united the always divided Lebanese. At the time, however, although the population blamed him for much of the war suffering, a little girl who knew nothing about politics or about him liked him, as they did with other monsters of European history. Jamal Pasha and General von Sanders, the commander of the German forces in Syria, had their summer headquarters in a village in Mount Lebanon. When he went about the village, and saw the little girl who later, as an adult, told the story. The Pasha warmed up to her, played with her hair, cajoled her, and said something nice to her. Then, as his relations with the Arab nationalists got worse, as he got angrier at the nationalists, he passed near the little girl and paid no attention to her. When that happened, she ran to her mother in tears because he had ignored her and not paid her the usual attention he used to give her. The whole of Greater Syria might have been scared of the Pasha and disliked him intensely. But for the little village girl, he was a nice man whose attention she missed. Remembered as the great and fearsome commander of the Ottoman army in Syria by most people, he was remembered as a likable, elderly figure by this one youth. Do we trust these contrary visions of one figure of the Great War? And do we conclude remembrance can be contradictory, uncertain, fragile, and yet real? Perhaps some of the complexity of the relationship between memory and war is that the gaps between what people tell us happened and what probably happened are simply the results of different interpretations of the same public figure, public event. To us who study the Great War, it was the worst of times, a time of suffering and deprivation. Yet listen to what one renowned novelist says about it. He experienced the Great War as a secure youth, sheltered and surrounded by family and tradition in the villages of Lebanon. It infused his formative years with stability and joy. He writes, "As for us youngsters, we did not care much about the war and the news of the war. We were happy in the summer of 1914 because we were back to our playgrounds. We left the news of the war to the adults." As time went by, he of course realized the suffering caused by the depth of the famine, the locust ravaging the area, the loss of relatives gone and never returned, and the other disasters the war caused. But that he had so many happy memories in the midst of disaster is real. Read or talk to people who lived the wars of the Middle East then and now, very recently now, and they will dwell on some extraordinary happy personal memories in the midst of tragedy. A walk on empty streets in peace at night. I remember the great historian Kamal Salibi talking about it. He taught at Harvard briefly at one point. Being unheard in the midst of tense checkpoints, shelling, or even kidnapping. The warmth of a family gathering in the middle of war and shelling and bombing, and personal friendships at times of great loss. All a mix of terrible fear and fragility with intensely memorable and appreciated souvenirs of times with the people they cared for. The passage of time altered recollections in the decades that followed the war. The older village people began to speak warmly about the Ottomans that they were happy to get rid of at first. And they found the foreign oppressors worse because more equipped, more organized, and more powerful. What became foreign to them was the French mandate that replaced the Ottomans in the Levant, in much of the Levant, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the war. Among the women of that village, the year of the French takeover, 1918, 1919, was remembered as the year of foreign French occupation. The passage of time also shaped the future. Allies in war became antagonists, rulers and ruled after the war. One population flaw was the massive influx of soldiers and imperial subjects in and through the Middle East during the war. This brought, for example, various British imperial citizens and subjects, Englishmen, Welshmen, Scots and Irish, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, West Indians, and others. They brought them into contact with the local populations of the provinces, and in making contact, they developed perspectives and prejudices about one another that they hadn't had before. The war played itself out in the Middle East and Africa, and not only on the Western Front. It proved that it incorporated the region into the broader world, but it also helped to crystallize existing prejudices and to foster new stereotypes formed in times of conflict. Soldiers from different empires gained a first-hand knowledge that formed the basis of a mixture of condescension, disdain, grudging respect towards the peoples of the region, and vice versa. The local populations, there is plenty of evidence, began to think of the foreigner as interested in prostitutes, not serious, this and that. A new distrust, a new looking down on the other began to develop with the horrors of the war, tarnishing the luster of Western modernity that was so admired in the 19th century. So the First World War was not just a moment of rupture, signaling a break from the globalized world of the years before 1914, but also a moment in which new networks of global integration were formed. And did such contacts and encounters have lasting effects on the perspectives of outsiders of the Middle East and of the local population about the West? In particular, did the relationships that developed between military officers and soldiers with each other and with the local population affect the relationships that emerged after the war in the period of the mandate and since and up to today? It is reasonable to assume so when one compares the eagerness to copy from the West, to learn from the West in the 19th century, to the current suspicion, wariness about the West and its intentions. In that sense, the First World War, far from putting an abrupt end to the first age of globalization, heralded the elaboration of the new networks of movements, bringing unprecedented numbers of military and technical personnel to the Middle East. But in doing so, it served to entrap the region in new global structures of imperial governance and to lay down the foundations of a new type of mutual suspicion. What is quoted most often is the negative, not the positive. And I would like to end with a poem from Khalil Gibran, who spent much of his life in the States, but was born in the Middle East. It is a lamentation, but in contrast to Robert Graves' recalling war in our program, this lamentation is about a different type of loss. Here is one selection. My people died from hunger, and he who did not perish from starvation was butchered with the sword. And I am here in this distant land, roaming among a joyful people who sleep upon soft beds and smile as the days around, while the days smile upon them. There may be a way out from violence, suffering, and mutual stereotyping. Distrust is not irreversible. Soft power is still an option, and it has proven its effectiveness before, and perhaps it can do so again, but not in my lifetime. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. The phrase, the new looking down on the other, I think is one that we will all have to remember as a legacy of the Great War. David Levering Lewis, professor of history at NYU, is the author of the magisterial 2-volume biography of W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as works that range from the Dreyfus Affair in France, Martin Luther King, and his much read and translated into many languages book on the interface of Islam and Christendom called God's Crucible, Islam and the Making of Europe. And so we're just so honored that you're here, Professor Levering Lewis.
It is a great pleasure to be here. And a bit of a surprise because I have cycled through a number of scholarly concerns. And the Great War is one that once occupied my attention as part of another book that I wrote called The Race to Fashoda, European Colonialism and African Resistance in the Scramble for Africa. And it is that book that is present in the thoughts in this paper. I hope I don't disgrace myself, but my Great War bibliography is a bit rusty. The African Roots of the War. Margaret Macmillan's The War That Ended Peace opens with a question which there is as yet no agreed upon final answer. How could Europe have done this to itself? Her splendid book infers that the answer lies with a small number of men, and they were all men, we are reminded, who could have said no. Indeed, there were some notable men and women who did say no to the war. They sally across the pages of Adam Hochschild's brilliant To End All Wars, Keir Hardie and his partner Sylvia Pankhurst, the anti-imperialist scold Emily Hobhouse and her pacifist brother Stephen, Field Marshal Sir John French's unlikeliest of siblings, Charlotte Despard, and the great tribune Jean Jaurès, and he survived an assassin's bullet. But as far as the men whose opinions mattered, the sovereigns, cabinet ministers, generals, and politicians, had they restrained their allies, prioritized diplomacy, sent no fatal ultimatums, given no final mobilization orders, Sarajevo would have been yet another Balkan incident, not the casus belli that destroyed a world order. Imagining Europe's yay-saying elites as naysayers, however, is a possibility that determinists would insist flies in the face of the complex system of spring-loaded adversarial alliances merely waiting the triggering incident. For the determinists, the war was ultimately inevitable, absent the manipulative mastery of a Bismarck, say. Whatever the proximate causes of the war, the European elites sanctioned. The Cambridge historian Richard Evans reminds us that the European elites shared a generally positive attitude towards war and a collective epistemology based on notions of honor, expectations of swift victory, and ideas of social Darwinism. The answer as to how Europeans could do such terrible violence to themselves lies to a considerable degree with answers to another question, to wit, what of the consequences to themselves of the terrible violence they perpetrated on non-Europeans? Fair to say, few times in history has manifest destiny and asymmetrical power produced such transformational violence as in so brief a time. The pacification and removal of the original peoples of the United States was a centennial enterprise, whereas a single generation sufficed for quinine, repeating rifles, and Maxim guns to spread European disruption from Cairo to the Cape in the name of Christianity, commerce, and civilization. W.E.B. Du Bois's prescient The African Roots of the War appeared in May 1915, the May 1915 issue of Atlantic Monthly. Readers were meant to ponder the fateful consequences of what Du Bois saw as an ineluctable collision of racial arrogance and geopolitics that made the so-called Dark Continent the cause of the World War that had repeatedly come within an ace of starting above or below the Sahara. Du Bois described the European presence in Africa as a technological hegemony that excused, as he said, lying treaties, rivers of rum, murder, assassination, rape, and torture in the name of racial superiority. In the 30-year span, from the Berlin West African Conference to the war declaration against Serbia, Africa's real estate was partitioned, Africans' independence extinguished. Excuse me. Africans' independence extinguished, Africans' humanity devalued, and Europeans' own values corrupted by the prerogatives of imperial dominion. Du Bois had in mind Great Britain's unilateral occupation of Egypt at the behest of her great banking houses, an affront to French interests that effectively launched the African scramble after 1882. He had in mind the Second Boer War 17 years later, when Cecil Rhodes's attempt to steal the Transvaal goldfields caused it to happen. 75,000 soldiers and civilians dead from Great Britain's bloodiest combat since Waterloo, 26,000 of them Afrikaner, women and children, dead in Lord Milner's concentration camps. The institutional barbarity of Leopold's Congo was exceptional in scale, but hardly different from the draconian policing of indigenous peoples by other colonial powers. The French in Equatorial Africa, Chad, and Mali mimicked the Belgians. The first genocide of the 20th century was perpetrated in German Southwest Africa, where Dr. Ernest Goering, father of future Reich Marshal, authorized the serial extermination of the Herero and Nama peoples in Namibia in 1904, an enormity approvingly reported in the German press and achieved with a full arsenal of new tools: barbed wire, Maxim machine guns, scorched earth sweeps, and poisoned aquifers. Du Bois was among the rare Victorian imperialists who tried to make macroeconomic sense of the global imperial horror show. The African roots of the war anticipated Vladimir Lenin's 1916 tract, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Du Bois's article and Lenin's tract advanced virtually identical theories to explain why monopoly capitalism had temporarily escaped the fatal internal contradictions of class conflict and overproduction through export of surplus capital to undeveloped lands. Instead of channeling the highest stage of capitalism, however, imperialism would have better been conceived as the highest stage of ethnocentrism, a collective psychosis in which the compensations of pigment increasingly deformed the humanitarianism of Africa's occupiers. The eccentric Swedish scholar Sven Lindqvist is convinced that Kurtz's last words in The Heart of Darkness, that great literary masterpiece of empire, exterminate all the brutes, were taken from Herbert Spencer's Social Statics, foundation text of social Darwinism. Spencer's ideology demanded cold-hearted discipline. Quote, "The forces which are working out the great scheme of perfect happiness exterminate such sections of mankind as stand in their way," he catechized his Victorians. "Be he human or be he brute, the hindrance must be got rid of." Lord Cromer's language in The Government of Subject Races was tonier than Conrad Kurtz's. The proconsul of Egypt sniffed, "An Englishman need not always inquire too closely what these people themselves think." Even after the brutes succeeded in making themselves heard, as when in 1885 radical Islamists eliminated British presence in the Sudan, and 11 years later Abyssinians disgraced the Italians at Adwa, the occupiers grasped almost nothing of the large political and technological implications for themselves. Indeed, when the British defeated the largest African army yet arrayed against them at Omdurman, they missed entirely the 19th century's most important military legacy for the impending 20th. For Major Douglas Haig, the future BEF commander, and Lieutenant Winston Churchill, experiencing his first military engagement, Omdurman on that September morning in 1898 was the apotheosis of empire. 50,000 rifle and spear-wielding Sunni Arabs charged Herbert Kitchener's 5,000 troops and their Maxim guns. Churchill's best-selling The River War described the results. Thus ended the Battle of Omdurman, he enthused, the most signal triumph ever gained by the arms of science over barbarians. Within the space of 5 hours, the strongest and best-armed savage army yet arrayed against a modern European power has been destroyed and dispersed with hardly any difficulty. 10,000 Sudanese died, 16,000 were wounded. The British suffered 48 fatalities. Adam Hochschild cites the Army and Navy's journal's endorsement of the Maxim, a weapon which is specially adapted to terrify a barbarous or semi-civilized foe. By the time Du Bois's Atlantic Monthly article appeared, Maxim guns had terrified civilized foes out of their saddles, entrenched them behind 25,000 miles of barbed wire since the previous summer, and killed 25 times the number of Sunni Sudanese dead at Omdurman. A list of African flashpoints that could have ignited a European firestorm before 1914 were mostly unfamiliar to Atlantic Monthly's American subscribers and merely half remembered by a good number of European. Quote, France and England at Fashoda, Italy at Adjoa, Italy and Turkey in Tripoli, England and Portugal at Delagoa Bay, England, Germany, and the Dutch in South Africa, France and Spain and Morocco, Germany and France in Agadir, and the world at Algeciras. At the heart of 18 years of diplomatic gambits, real estate acquisitions, military expeditions, lay the Egyptian question, Britain's arbitrary occupation of that country and France's humiliating exclusion from it. When the French expedition across Africa to the headwaters of the Nile had arrived at Fashoda only to be met by the victor of Omdurman's civil invitation to decamp promptly, the French found themselves diplomatically isolated and militarily unprepared. Although the Great War didn't start in 1898 at Fashoda, as well it might have, the Fashoda incident virtually guaranteed full-fledged hostilities between Europe's major powers in less than a generation. When it came time to play their parts in the tragedy of August 1914, the principal players arrived with diplomatic scripts decisively revised after Fashoda. France's ambidextrous foreign minister, Théophile Delcassé, assuaged the pride of his country's colonial lobby and secretly sailed to St. Petersburg in summer 1899 to close the loophole in an alliance whose partner had left France on the Upper Nile with little to show for her 5 billion gold franc investment in Russia. Delcassé returned with a revised military convention and language binding Russia to all of France's security issues and vice versa for the duration of their adversaries' triple alliance. Meanwhile, the French ambassador and the British Foreign Secretary quietly signed the innocuous-sounding addition to Article 4 of the 1898 Niger Convention, which finally closed the 16-year dispute over the Egyptian question. By its terms, the Nile Valley became officially British, but with a tacit understanding that the rest of North Africa, North Africa, west of the Nile, was France's for the taking. Fashoda lifted enough of the albatross of Anglophobia to return the German enemy front and center to France's security preoccupations. Almost simultaneously, Germany moved front and center to Britain's security preoccupations because of the latter's aggressive naval and colonial ambitions. Fast forward from 1899 through the series of Entente Cordiale agreements in spring of 1904, the August 1907 actually, Anglo-Russian Convention ending the great game between them in Afghanistan and Persia, to the July 1912 Anglo-French Naval Accord, and you have Great Britain and the tightened-up dual alliance that emerged out of Africa, primed to meet the Triple Alliance. The men who designed these confrontational alliances possessed an untroubled belief in capacity, an exalted sense of righteousness born of a 30-year run of exploitative success in Africa, all of it destined to bring to their own continent the sociological and technological injuries inflicted upon their imperial possessions. It is said that Lord Kitchener told several intimates that, contrary to general expectations, he feared that the war would be long and bloody. He was one of the few who divined the implications of Omdurman, as well he might. Du Bois opened his remarkable Atlantic Monthly essay with a quotation from Pliny the Elder in Latin, which he slightly mangled: Semper novi quid ex Africa, or properly, ex Africa semper aliquid novi. In any case, there was something out of Africa, and it continues to provide it. Thank you.
It's a haunting image that the men with their untroubled belief in capacity unleashed on their own continent the same violence they had inflicted in their colonial powers. Thank you so much for that. Professor Jay Winter of Yale is the Charles, is it Still? Still Professor of History and one of the leading historians of the Great War. His many books include Socialism and the Challenge of War, The Great War and the British People, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, the Great War in European Cultural History, and Dreams of Peace and Freedom. We're so looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, and thank you indeed for the invitation to come to this event, which is really part of an avalanche of commemorative moments that have spanned the globe. 100 years after the outbreak of the First World War, it's truly gone global. It is no longer the history of the Western Front, it's the history of the whole world in a paroxysm of violence in which something happened in the battlefields of the war, something monstrous happened in the battlefields of the war that transformed, maybe we can even use the term revolutionized violence, to a level that the world had never seen before. Primarily violence against soldiers, yes, but more frequently violence against civilians, which is so centrally a part of the history of the Middle East. And it's a violence which continues to this day. In a month's time, in 2 months' time, we will go through the ritual denial that the Armenian genocide happened. The ritual, the rhetorical violence of which Homi Bhabha spoke is being practiced today. The genocide is like most silences. Everybody knows what nobody says, and yet the Turkish government insists upon this absurd lie, which so many Turkish historians are having, I think, finally the courage to admit. Now, my subject is transnational history, and I want to use the phrase in two contexts. The first is within the historical profession, and the second is in the field of public history. Transnational history is the way in which family history and world history have crossed. That started in 1914, and it is going through a period of what I'm astonished may be considered to be a revival of interest in the First World War on the family level. In Paris, the Archives Nationales and the Bibliothèque Nationale have issued, through all media, a grand collecte, asking anybody who has a box of Great-Uncle Harry's photographs to bring them to the National Archives or the Bibliothèque, and they will automatically become archives. In other words, ordinary people have joined the pantheon of the nation. No longer the great men, but the ordinary men, the ordinary people you admire. In France alone, I know this directly, there are now 20,000 new archives of the First World War that have come from families. And it is that power, that emotive, affective power, in which family history and world history cross, and in which they have become braided together, I think, permanently, that explains the aura surrounding the First World War as a sacred event around the world. This country has less of it. Perhaps it's the Second World War that is occluded, perhaps still the Civil War, I'm not sure. But I can tell you that what happened in Britain, where they have their own Grand Collecte, through Oxford in particular, but not only there, is astonishing in the sense in which ordinary people make a history of catastrophe their own. Now, what is transnational history? It's history written by transnational historians. In order to explain this, I want to provide I want to discuss this issue on two levels. The first is related to what we now call the memory boom. The memory boom is an industry of commemoration in which historians play a part. This meeting is part of the memory boom. It costs money. Indeed, we are grateful to those who have provided it. But it is always the case that the act of remembrance or acts of remembrance are commercial matters, and they are global in character. Now, many of these transnational historians are products of the expansion of higher education between 1960 and 1990, trebling in North America and in Europe. I can remember when I started studying the First World War 50 years ago, believe it or not. The Carnegie Foundation and Woodrow Wilson School put together a fund to try to persuade more graduate students to go into college teaching because there weren't enough candidates for the jobs available. This is indeed ancient history of a kind that I can remember, but has long since vanished. Now, what's happened not only is the expansion of the population of those in higher education, but the number of jobs that were available to people in many fields of the humanities. If you match that with the real decline in costs of travel, you can understand, and I see one or two in this room who fit the rubric, that transnational historians are people who are born in one place, educated in a second, and teach in a third. And they bring, therefore, optics of a very different kind onto historical change and onto their understanding of historical change. Now, just to give you an example, my pupil, Christopher Clark, now Regius Professor-elect at Cambridge, was born in Sydney, where he had a very promising career ahead of him in the Sydney Opera House, I might add. Went to Berlin to start his studies in German history, then came to Cambridge, where he took my advice to write history now and sing later. There are so many others that I can point to, but I can do that in a much simpler way. I've recently been the editor of the 3-volume Cambridge History of the First World War. There are 72 authors in it. 50 of them are transnational historians, 50. Because of this sociological opening that provided the passports and indeed the jobs that historians together have at their disposal. Now, at the same time, I want to parallel transnational history in the academy and in what I call public history, which is more and more an area in which we serve, in which we have to serve, in which we are morally obliged to serve, in providing the history of the First World War to a very, very large public around the world who are not only interested in it, but dedicated to preserving that memory. Now, transnational history has come in the 1990s and after, and one might say that it parallels the end of the Cold War, which was basically conceived in national terms. But before that, transnational history today builds on three different generations. It's not the alternative to national history, it's a better way of doing national history, by seeing it from perspectives which go outside of the national frontiers. Now, what we do is we draw upon three earlier generations of historical writing, and I'll very briefly summarize them. The first was what I termed the Great War generation. Now, these were scholars. Churchill was mentioned earlier. He certainly benefited and made a profit from writings about the First World War, and indeed the Second, leading to his Nobel Prize, certainly not for peace, but for literature. There are many others that we can talk about who were former soldiers, public officials with direct knowledge of the war, either through their own military service or through alternative service to their country's effort. Now, this first generation wrote history from the top down, by and large through direct experience of the events they described, and the central actor of these stories is the state. There's no question about that. These are texts of self-justification, a posture adopted in virtually all official histories of the armed forces, and indeed of governments, which is many mistakes were made. I always like the passive tense of that, but I didn't make any of them. They're self-justificatory in 100 different ways. Now, the second generation of writers of the First World War, of the history of the First World War, I call the generation 50 years on. These people wrote in the 1960s, and they wrote not only the history of politics and decision-making, but the history of society. This was the moment when social history had a cachet that it actually has subsequently lost. But it came at a moment, I think, when the notion that the history of social structures and social movements was at the heart of historical research. I taught at the University of Warwick in the 1970s. E.P. Thompson's great The Making of the English Working Class was, as it were, a signature of this generation. And social movements and social structures became central to the writing of the history of the First World War in the 1960s. Now, there are two great advantages of the historians of the 60s. The first was the archives were open. 50 years ruled, made it possible for us to see things that we couldn't possibly see. And this led, for instance, to the breakthrough in German scholarship on the outbreak of the war that led to 2 volumes of Fritz Fischer, which historians are still arguing about to this day. But he was a student who was trained in theology, who was shocked, morally shocked by what he saw in the archives about the nature of the German participation in the war crisis of 1914. The second thing is what I want to emphasize most clearly because it speaks to my first interpretation of public history. This is academic history. What happened in the 1960s is the visualization of history. You know, I'm now close to the end of my academic career, but the more I write and think about history, the more I believe that what people see matters much more than what they read, including every single word that I've written. The visual became central in the 1960s in providing a bridge between history within the academy and history outside it. It first started, I think, in 1964 when the BBC launched its second channel with a monumental 26-part history of the war, exhaustively researched in film archives and vetted by an impressive group of military historians. This is really extraordinary because the 2 historians who wrote this, John Terrain and Corelli Barnett, are distinctly conservative. I could use another adjective, but nonetheless, their script, the words, are justification. You know, General Haig, Earl Haig, did what he had to do, and he won. That's basically what the scripts say. And the other generals are of the same order. They did what they had to do. The moral questions, indeed the military questions, were covered by this. Amazingly, and you can see this in the BBC Sound archives, which there are 50,000 responses that were charted, is exactly the opposite. Because what people did by viewing the series was to see the pictures and ignore the words. And the pictures showed that something monstrous had happened on the battlefields of the First World War, which, partly because a change in degree turned into a change of kind, that is to say, millions of men became matchsticks that were simply piled up for disposal in one way or another, of the same order as we have seen in this Republic of Suffering, but on a much larger scale, even larger than the scale of the American Civil War, perhaps 10 times that scale. Now, when a difference in degree turns into a different in kind is an interesting question, and I don't have a direct answer to it, but I can tell you that the visualization of war, which happened in France in a great series of Marc Ferro, almost never mentioned before, is a view of the war as a catastrophe, a tragedy in which the decencies of ordinary soldiers were betrayed by the mindlessness of the men who led them politically or militarily, who could not find a way to get out of the war once they started it. Now, the third generation of historians that led up to the transnational moment, I call the Vietnam moment. And I think I'm not the only one here who was a friend of Paul Fussell who basically started it off. His book, The Great War in Modern Memory, is a masterpiece. I happen to disagree with it, but what does it mean to disagree with a masterpiece? It's ridiculous. The strength of that book is that it opened up I think, a movement that has broken down the barrier between literary studies of the First World War and more generally understood historical ones. They mean nothing. That distinction means absolutely nothing. He was a soldier of the Second World War who understood irony viscerally in his stomach. He still carried around a piece of shrapnel in his knee and remembered how scared he was as an officer being told what to do by a professional soldier, a sergeant, who, when the two of them hit the ground during the Battle of the Bulge, only Paul Fussell got up. The irony of war, the absurdity, the stupidity of war is something he knew viscerally. Now, this generation was added to by some very remarkable scholars. One was Sir John Keegan, who wrote a book called The Face of Battle, 1976. Fussell's is 1975. Another extraordinary book based on anthropology by Eric Leed called No Man's Land, which basically asked the question, how is battle possible? It is so terrifying that there's no way to deal with it in fundamental ways. Well, now we come, I think, to the moment that I want to draw your attention to most conspicuously, which I call the transnational moment. Now, I believe that it was a moment in which history inside the academy and history outside the academy merged, came together. And I want to tell you how that happened in a particular way. In 1986, I was teaching at Cambridge University. I spent many years. And I got an approach from a French politician and one of his fonctionnaires. They were looking for an historian in Britain who could contribute to creating some part of a museum of the history of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British, French, and German. And believe it or not, although there were hundreds of historians of the First World War in Britain, all over the place, you're looking at the only one who could work in French. Now, my students at Cambridge in those days had no languages other than English. They pretended to have languages, they still do. But as working languages, Tommy Atkins was the center of the stage for the history of the First World War, and the King's English was good enough for them. Now, what happened was that this notion of creating a museum of the First World War of the Battle of the Somme in the First World War, followed from family history. The man who asked me to do this was called Max Lejeune. He had been Minister of Defense during the Suez Crisis, and his dad had been a soldier during the Battle of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme itself had been occluded by Verdun in 1916, and in French popular memory, Verdun was the symbol, the overwhelming symbol of the horror of the First World War. Well, the Somme was just as bad. I don't want to distinguish between them. His father came back, Max Lejeune's father, from war, and maltreated his son. He was a man among hundreds of thousands who were broken without having a single scratch on their bodies. And now, at the age of 75, Max Lejeune wanted to make peace with his dad. And the way he thought of doing it was to create a museum in honor of his father. I told him immediately that memory doesn't heal, that it won't do what you think it does. But he had to do it anyway. This was a moment, really a personal mission. And as a result of that, I joined an extraordinary group of historians and others, museographers, in designing representations of violence. And this is the theme that I want to raise for this conference in particular. There has been a fundamental shift in representations of violence in the 20th century, such as to define war more from the, let's say, 1970s on, as an abomination. There has been as it were, a discrediting of war as a form of political choice or political action. And historians, both inside the academy and outside the academy, have played a very important role in delegitimating war visually. Now, once I said yes to this offer, there were two things that were important. The first is I persuaded Max Lejeune that in order to build a museum, he had to create a research center before it was in existence. Otherwise, the link between the academy and public history would not exist, and it's very, very hard to create a research center after a museum gets started. They agreed, and as a result of that, there was a group of 40 historians from all over the world, really transnational from New Zealand on, as it were, New Zealand to Newfoundland and Nuneaton and Nanterre, really from all over the world, who took part in creating this museum. Now, in order to do this museum, in order to make it, as it were, important, there had to be a visual approach. Orhan Pamuk famously said that museums are places that turn time into space. Yes, indeed, but they turn time into visualized representation. And what we had to do was to create a representation of war that would do justice to the monstrousness of the Battle of the Somme. Now, this was a moment which provided me with sufficient panic to be unforgettable. Once I had the chance, then the question is what to do. How do you design a war museum? How do you represent the violence that took over 1 million casualties in the Battle of the Somme, and only the Battle of the Somme between the 1st of July and the 10th of November 1916. Now, I hope I can do this. How do we turn this on? The panel is locked out by the technician. Censorship, even here. Can someone, now what do I do? Can someone see if the technician can turn on? Oh, it's there. Right, let me go back. How do I go back? That's it. I took my family many times on holidays to a village in southeastern Switzerland, Maria, and it took 2 days to get there from Cambridge. We always stopped in Alsace, and I remember my children were then 9 and 10, fed up with driving and wanted to do something for them. And what we did for them was to see a very funny Tanguy installation in the Kunstmuseum in Basel. That was for them. You know, it's a Keith Robinson machine with all kinds of bobs and things that make noise. It's a wonderful, wonderful bit of art, public art. And after we did something for them, they did something for me, which is we went upstairs in the Kunstmuseum in Basel, and I had one child in one hand and one child in the other. And I can remember walking in, it's not that designed that way anymore, into the museum, second floor, and I saw that. And I remember telling my children, your dad has to sit down. This was the only painting in the room, and it knocked me over. Now, why did it knock me over? It did so for a simple reason. It is relentlessly, unremittingly horizontal. This is the perfect Reformation painting. In order to believe that this dead man, look at the, as it were, dislocated middle finger because of crucifixion, the detail, the realist detail is astonishing. Look at the hair falling easily over the shroud in what looks like a box. In order to believe that this dead man will rise on Easter Sunday, you must have faith and faith alone. It is the perfect Renaissance painting. it is not mitigated by Marys or angels or Joseph of Arimathea. Any of the panoply of the Gospels is gone, and the only reality is the reality of death. Now, it struck me so forcibly, and by the way, one of my students at Cambridge 8 years later brought up to me with a smile on his face Dostoevsky's The Idiot, in which Prince Mishkin says, I just saw a painting which almost made me lose my faith. It's this one. It's the same painting. And immediately, it's one of those moments which is non-rational, I saw what should be the principle of the design of the museum. It should not be vertical, the language of hope. It should be horizontal, the language of mourning. And when I saw that, in a split second, basically, I brought that to the group of 40 who were designing the museum, and awful lot of argument, awful lot of quarreling, and some experts thought it would never work. But finally, they came to see that this was a way of creating a visualization of violence which differed from virtually every other museum of war in the world. Now, I thought, is this Holbein being a genius at the age of 24 alone? No, it isn't. Montaigne had been there before. The Lamentation of Christ, roughly 1480, changed what I would call the perspective of the tragedy, the tragic, tortured death of Christ. And with that sense, I looked around elsewhere and found Vittorio Carpaccio in the Dead Christ. I'm sorry for the misspelling at the top. But the oddity there, and I have yet to sort this out, I believe there will be someone in the audience who knows if Carpaccio saw Holbein before he did this. It strikes me as very likely. Look at the hair on the Christ. Look at the unremitting nature of it. This is simply the preparation of a body for interment in the tomb. We went into the 20th century to see parallels, and they're everywhere. I'll just give you one. This is Katie Kollwitz's The Widow of 1922. I don't believe she could have done that without Montaigne, that the, as it were, the configuration of mourning is what we wanted to do. And the reason why it mattered so much that we did it is that we aimed at a pacifist museum. We aimed at a museum to be opened in 1992, the Maastricht year, where the notion of the abomination of war would be, as it were, the other side of the coin of European integration. That a transnational approach to war had to give up the notion that the Germans were evil. And we did this in a host of ways. Now let me show you very briefly before concluding what the museum did with this. The first thing we did were cut out fosse. These are dugouts of maybe 5 inches deep and about 20 feet long. And we put in the fosse the articles of everyday life of soldiers who had to live underground. In other words, one of the things you have to know about the First World War is that soldiers, dug underground in order to stay alive. The war was a subterranean, a troglodyte war, Paul Fussell called it, and among others. And what we showed was the similarity, of course, between the materials that soldiers found necessary, lice powder, toothpaste, and whatever, and the weapons, too, which were almost identical. The second thing we wanted to do was to challenge what I call pseudo-realism. In those days, the Imperial War Museum was engaged in a certain kind of representation of war, which we wanted to challenge. And the first is what might be described as the total immersion approach, being there. The notion that one can really get to the point of sharing the experience of war, which I believe is a complete absurdity. No one can know what it was that these soldiers went through. We can't have the stench. We can't have the colors, the absurd mixtures that made life and death in the trenches something surreal, something uncanny, something beyond the sense experience of ordinary people. Now, we did as well, tried as well, to put in Born Video, these are video screens, 52 of them, contemporary films that showed these items in use, that showed how they were put together and what they did and what they didn't do. And here's where a visualization of war could use, I think, a tool which has become central to our understanding of war. In 1914, the Kodak Company revolutionized representations of warfare. By 1918, there were 6 million pocket cameras on the Western Front alone, 6 million of them. And they provided uncensorable visual material of what war looked like. That's what the Grand Collecte is now returning to the archives, because they are in everybody's attic. And because they have a certain sacred element, people don't throw them away. They try to give them to public institutions and to preserve them that way. Now, we did something else, too, which I must say took an awful lot of time for me to persuade my colleagues, mes chers collègues, to do this. This is a syllogism, attack, defense, surgery. And the surgical Faust has within it the flute that Georges Duhamel, one of the great French novelists, bitingly, satirically entitling his war memoir, Civilisation. He didn't need to put a question mark next to it. Everybody could see that it was there, in which he played the flute to keep his sanity between surgical amputations for weeks at a time after the great battles of 1917 and 1918. And again, we could see the fragility of the defensive material in these videos, which would show soldiers trying to use what appeared to be medieval plate to stop artillery from tearing them apart, which is an absurdity. 80% of the 10 million men who died in the First World War were killed by artillery. That's the revolution. The industrialization of violence was that. We attempt to show this. We use the horizontal and the vertical in what's called the salle des portraits. First is photographs of 1914. Those who couldn't imagine war, as we heard from Margaret Macmillan last night, it's an unlikelihood of something as dreadful as this. And behind it, the 53 lithographs of Otto Dix's collection called Der Krieg, which have a horizontal expressionist awfulness, which looks like this. This is a soldier, and Dix fought on the Western Front at Péronne, as Ernst Junger did, and so many others did, and took 10 years before he could begin to turn his images into art. He used photographs, by the way, as mediations in order to be able to recreate, as it were, the horrible reality of the trenches. Now, let me just conclude, therefore, on a statement that there is a public domain to transnational history which is there all over the world. For example, the Imperial War Museum, responding, I think, to some of our ideas, has transformed itself. And it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. I urge everybody to go there in London. It's the major tourist attraction in the city. And now it's become not just the Imperial War Museum, but the War Museum of the world, including the other side. Before, in the earlier period, it was entirely about the British war effort. It is no longer that. The transnational image is there. Secondly, there is an extraordinary website I recommend to all of you. It's called Europeana. And www.europeana.com has over 150,000 archives of the First World War from all over the world, and it is based upon individual and scholarly contributions. It's an interesting question how long that will survive. It has to have funding permanently, but I believe it will. I have some reasons to believe that, which I'm happy to share with the rest of you. Now, what followed? In 1992, when the museum was opened, I had the unhappy task of showing Ernst Junger around the museum. Unhappy because his friend, his dear friend, François Mitterrand, for whom Junger was a bit like Nietzsche, fixed the date of the opening. I had nothing to say about it. And the date was the 16th of July, 1992, 50 years to the date of the Grand Rafle in Paris, when Junger and all of his friends were there, when the first great Jewish roundup took place in Paris. So, an anniversary that made that particular day one I didn't want to mark. Now, afterwards, there was an attempt to move beyond a museum by taking our approach to the cultural history of the war and putting it on television. And I was lucky enough to do that through the PBS channel KCET in Los Angeles, who together with the BBC put out the cash, $6 million, to create a series an 8-hour television series called The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century, which came out in 1996. It was entirely transnational in character. Following that, there were a whole series of projects, but the last one I want to draw to your attention is the Cambridge History, which came out last year. First thing I can say that makes it transnational is it's the very first time that one of these doorstoppers, one of these great, as it were, academic summaries of knowledge at a particular moment in time was published in French and in English at the same time. No other Cambridge history has ever been published in French, you know, as if somehow the English language is the repository of the greatest wisdom that we have. Only in part, one might say. The second thing is that I persuaded all of the 72 authors to forego their rights and royalties in the creation of a scholarship fund to students from all over the world who study the First World War. We all know this is probably the worst moment materially, economically, for graduate students in history, what I know, probably elsewhere, in my lifetime. This is the worst. And after all, you know, we historians who are white-haired and so on, what is, $500 after taxes? For a graduate student, that's everything. That's reaching the end of the month. That's reaching the end of the dissertation. And only one of our 72 actually refused. I won't tell you his name now, but if you want to know, I'll tell you. It is a name I'm sure you know. Now, the final point I wanted to do is to say how central to the experience of the Cambridge history is the visual dominating it. I want to show you how we used the visual. Here, for example, you know, making David Lewis's point in another way, is a photograph taken by the commandant of a German prisoner of war camp who wanted to know the nationalities of French soldiers in his camp. The problem was he wasn't the brightest man in the world because, as you can see on the bottom right, he's put a Vietnamese into his African map of nationalities. If you want to see the same point again about, as it were, race and its meaning, here is a photograph I got from Shantanu Das, which I think is wonderful, which is an Indian soldier signing up for the duration with his thumbprint. Look where who's on top and who's on bottom, as it were. It's a wonderful image of the nature of that particular social contract. I want to make sure that we register that the social contract was not entirely prejudiced, that there was indeed affection, and there were very strong ties between Africans and indeed Chinese. There were 150,000 Chinese who came from Shandong province to help dig the trenches and so on. According to Ko Ki-ju, who's the historian of this population, over 1,000 of them have, as it were, started families and are still, those descendants are still there to this day in Paris. Now, encounters, global encounters, transnational ones. This is a photograph in the Baie d'Issey, one of the great archives in Paris, of a doctor from Alexandria examining a Vietnamese laborer for paralytic beriberi. One of the great sources of transnational history is medical photography, one of the really important, where we can see people from all over the world engaging, as it were, in physical encounters, bodily encounters with men they could never possibly have imagined. Here's a point I want to raise again, I think specifically, Homie, towards that question of the representation of violence. Fundamental, because there is a brutality in a number, I would say hundreds, of archives of physicians who had cameras. Now, is that brutality something that doctors learn in medical school to enable them to do things that save the lives? Or is there something coarsening in medical education? I mean, there's a question about medical photography, because here's a man dying. He's a Serb in the Isle of Lido, which is off Corfu. These are the Serbs who came across the mountains in 1915 in the Great Retreat after their country was invaded for the second time and then finally really subdued. And they got to Albania and then were taken to these islands for medical care. What is it? Is it beneath the dignity of that doctor to realize that a man dying needs some, as it were, some respect? Is this photograph one that shows respect? Well, what follows is the aftermath. And look how he identifies himself as a classically educated individual, the Bark of Charon, with an individual who's staring into eternity. I have trouble with these, and I want the readers of the Cambridge history to have trouble with them. that the photographic record, which is overwhelmingly transnational in the First World War, by the millions, show us a kind of degeneration of warfare, which indeed is a very important element in the story. Degeneration of warfare to Agamben's bare life. In 1915, the Russian army, defeated early in the war, created mayhem not only in Galicia, but in the Russian provinces adjacent to it. 500,000 Russian Jews were deported from their homes, partly because of fears that they would greet the German and Austrians as liberators, and partly, I think, out of, shall we say, an old Russian tradition that armies that lose battles against soldiers can take it out on civilians. No one knows the number of Jews who were killed in this. John Reed, in fact, wrote a very interesting book about it, which had wide circulation. But this man saying Shacharit, the morning prayer on the left, is there a better image of what Agam meant by bare life? He has no canopy of law, of practice, of friendship, of solidarity, of community. This is in an open field in Volhynia, in the west of the Ukraine, far from where the fighting is now going on. I hope finally stop tomorrow. But nonetheless, this is a snapshot of the second critical revolution of the First World War, which is that the boundary between civilian and military targets was obliterated. I used to say blurred. I don't believe that anymore, because every country maltreated minorities within it. The worst instance, of course, is the Armenian genocide. Now, we have this vast archive. I'll just show you some examples of it. These are Hungarian troops going up. The Italian front has been ignored, too. The Austrian, German, Italian war was vertical in mountain terrain that is just as horrible as Passchendaele was, but in a vertical sense. This is what it looked like, the White War. And this is what happened when someone was wounded. He had to be taken down as if he was a piece of coal. Eastern Front is not part, as it should be, of the centerpiece of the historiography of the war. And in my view, the future has to move the center of gravity of the First World War from Paris to Warsaw. It just has to happen. Old war, new war, high tech. I'll show you a little more high tech in a moment. But when the high tech broke down, horses were there. This was a horse-drawn war as well. There were between 5 and 6 million horses that were bought from all around the world to make the Western Front and the Eastern Front happen when, as it were, material technology of the modern kind didn't work anymore. Mud, of course, and then the uncanny, the visual image of how did that half of a horse get up a tree? How did it get there? I mean, the questions about what happened before is, I think, a very interesting aesthetic one. I think that's over now. Well, let me just conclude. The transnational history of the First World War is, at the moment, I think, a way in which historians from all over the world can correct the Eurocentrism of previous historiography, including mine. I plead guilty to the accusation that in the 1960s and 70s, when I got started, the war was British, French, and German. I did 2 books on Paris, London, and Berlin. That's where it stopped. Now we must move east. We must move to Chernovitz. We must move to Saloniki. We must move to Vitebsk, because the war didn't end in 1918. Let me just make the final comment about the substantive innovations of the Cambridge history. The first is we have radically underestimated the number of people who died in the war. All military statistics are faulty, and some are just plain distortions for political reasons. But over 10 million people died, 1 million more than most other estimates. Among the radical underestimates is the proportion of those who were wounded and suffered from what we call shell shock. My own estimates are that among the 35 million men who were wounded in the First World War, my own estimates are 30% of them suffered from shell shock. The previous estimates were between 2 and 4%, partly reflecting attitudes at that time and attitudes today of shame and of stigma attached to those who suffer from mental illness. The third point is that Germany did not lose the war because of the United States or because of the blockade that was imposed on our continent. There are 6 different chapters that show that the German war effort collapsed from within. and that collapse from within was a function of the inability of the German state to distribute goods and services as between military and civilian claimants. It's a long story to work through, but the question of why the war ended is now linked to another one. Did it really end? What's 1918 got to do with Smyrna in 1922? What does it have to do with the Greco-Turkish war that created the modern state and created millions of further refugees who were then legitimated under international law as population transfer populations? And finally, it seems to me that we now know, and I think we have to continue, the Armenian genocide is not a marginal part of the narrative of the war. It's at the heart of the revolution of violence that took place. And this was not the historical consensus 30 years ago. It wasn't. It was looked down upon, partly because of the Western Front bias, but for other reasons too. And now we have archives sufficiently substantial to make the case that the genocide that took place in the First World War was built into the nature of the revolution of violence that took place. Transnational history, therefore, is about not only the appalling levels of violence, but also about the first great humanitarian efforts to deal with the refugees of the world. The Joint Distribution Committee was set up in 1914 because nobody in Jerusalem had anything to eat. The Hoover Feed the Children of Belgium project certainly played a part in this, but indeed there were foreign aid projects that exemplify humanity at its best in the midst of humanity at its worst. Will there be a fifth generation of historians? Absolutely. I have no doubt that what I describe is a moment, but it's a moment that actually has much more resonance in certain countries than in others. It's less present, for instance, in Italy than it is in Britain or in France. It's now very present in Germany in a way that I think wasn't the case there. In my years in Britain, there were a whole generation of German historians who moved from Germany to Britain and then on to the United States, like Volker Berghahn and others, because they couldn't stand the feudalism of German academic life. How much it's changed, I'll leave as an open question. But these people are here in this country. These people are here, these transnational historians, in this university, and long may they live. Thank you very much.
Set of reflections, including the visuals that I don't think we'll ever forget, but also the point of view of the visuals. That's something that I think implicit in your remarks is that the visual is uncensored, but it also has a perspective. So I have an opening question for you all. I think that this marvelous set of brave reflections indicates the significance of point of view and perspective as we try to make some kind of sense or understanding. And I've identified, I think, 7 that I heard, and I'd be interested in your views if this is correct or if I'm missing some or you want to add some or which you would like to elaborate. So the first is we see the Great War through the lens of our own wars. Having worked in Kosovo, I have to say I look at the Great War very differently than I think I did when I first learned about it. The second is we see it through the lens of our families, our own families. The third is we see it through the lens of our own physical moves, where we were born, where we studied, where we work. The fourth is we see it through the visuals with the rise of 20th century technologies, not just film, but also movies, also other forms of the visual. The fifth is we see it through the lens of the materials, so the daily life artifacts, including letters. I'd like to hear more about that. The sixth is we see it through the lens of the transnational, not just the individuals who move, but seeing that winners and losers are both in the same war, and it's all of their perspectives and the global, particularly here. Layla, your image of the 7-year-old, you know, that's haunting, a way to think about the war. And David, you're looking through W.E.B. Du Bois, looking through Africa. These lenses help us understand the global and the transgenerational, but then maybe here's the seventh. They help us understand that we are always looking through a perspective, looking through a perspective, looking through a perspective. So I'm reminded of the psychologist D.W. Winnicott, who says, the child has to see himself. The child has to see his mother seeing himself. When the child sees the mother seeing himself, he becomes an individual. So there's something about the way in which your self-reflection about the perspectives helps us understand the irreducible perspectival dimension of our comprehension.
Please. Would you like to start?
No. I want
Clear?
To,
Clear?
I want to listen to you.
Jerry, I am really stunned by your presentation. It's seldom that you encounter something really epistemologically new in our field. And this is just this, these optics introduce a way of not only seeing, but of demolishing categories that we use to interpret things, and we are locked into them. I mean, after all, this is an absurdity. War is. And we march time and again protesting what Congress is about to do, what our leaders elected and appointed are about to do. It doesn't seem to work. We still go to war. We're about to do that again, it would seem, with the president presenting to Congress, at great risk to all of us, a reconsideration of war powers. And it is to open the bottle and be overwhelmed by a kind of ignorant verbiage that will go on for a month. And that rhetorical moment, I think you mentioned, there will be so many of them. And our media, we're losing, after all, Brian Williams, our media will be ill-equipped to process this in any kind of prudent and deep way. And so we'll go to war, not with boots on the ground at first, but special ops. And it's just a motif that goes back to, it goes back to the Roman legions, really. If this kind of history were democratized, that is to say, if people thought that this is the way to see what war is about, I think it would be certainly salutary, perhaps helpful. Although at the end of the day, I must say, I think war is in the DNA, and I can't conceive of a way that it will not continue to be part of our human experience, although the Europeans do seem to have bloodied themselves sufficiently over time that there is an allergy and an aversion which may be ongoing.
Perhaps there's one more point I failed to make that may be relevant here too. What I found certainly over the last year of the avalanche of commemoration is that there is what I would call a three-generational structure of remembrance. Grandparents and grandchildren form bonds over the heads of that difficult generation in the middle of parents. And it's the grandchildren who get the grandparents to tell them what it was like. And what's extraordinary, for example, in the case of Pat Barker and her great literature is, I worked with her for a long time, and it was the grandparents who were silent because their children didn't want to know, who get stirred into action when the grandchildren want to know, because of the love that they share. Now that is history over 60 years. There's a generation. I'm not sure if the First World War boom, the war boom, is going to continue for very long, but this is something that is really driving it. It's certainly true in the revival and indeed important historiography of the Armenian genocide. I would like to know if this is the case in Syria and Lebanon too. You spoke wonderfully of one part of your family, but I'm sure there are others. That family memories are not outside of our interest. I think this is really important, and seeing the expansion of the documentation of families, which photography, of course, is central. I think Bourdieu is the one who said that the daughters-in-law are introduced to families through photograph albums, where you know who isn't speaking to whom, and so on. That how did it work in your case? The First World War came out through a number of family facets, I would imagine.
Absolutely, and I wanted to really thank the two of you for, I wish I took your classes, you know, I just learned so much even in this one, whatever it was, 1 hour session. But one thing I want to make, a point I want to make is World War I is talked about much more than World War II. You know, it's very interesting. I don't know if in Europe it's true to some extent, but people, it's the famine, the hunger, you know, stories of people spitting a raisin and the children running and eating the cover of the raisin. You know, so the suffering of those people at that time. So I wanted to raise the question is that the grandparents talked all the time about World War I. Nobody talked about World War II in the Middle East. They simply did not. And you're right, it is family oriented because they pass it on when the children are ready to hear it. But people look forward to making money, you know, succeeding, and nobody likes to be a victim. There are so many victims all over, but certainly in the Middle East. Yesterday, listening to really the wonderful talk we listened to, I was thinking, we're talking of very powerful countries if you are from my part of the world. Germany, France, England, they had their problems, they had their issues, but for someone sitting in a village in Iraq or in Egypt, no water, no education, did they see themselves as victims that cannot change the foreign occupier, whether it's an Ottoman or later a British or French? Did they see themselves as victims? Because I did not get the feeling, I don't know enough, that the Europeans, however remote, saw themselves as victims. You know, there is a very interesting scholar I met here who works on Austria, for example. I want to know if her parents saw, you know, forgetting the ethnic identity, you know, just the national identity. Because in ethnic identity, it's very easy to see oneself as a Jew in Armenia. But did people see themselves as victims? And if they did, maybe they did not want to talk about it. Because in my part of the world, they unfortunately only respect success and money. I mean, once upon a time, what mattered is that you are related by blood to the prophet, or if you are a Christian, that you have some connection to the patriarch. But this has changed a long time ago. And what matters now is if you have a Volkswagen, or if you have a Mercedes, and etc. So the focus on money and success, material success, has taken away the desire to say the truth about victimization. And yet, who can study the Middle East and not think of victims because of what's happening, because of foreign intervention? So this is one concern that affects the reading of the past. And we're so behind also. The only country, Egypt had very good national archives, as you know probably. Syria did. Syria had this one woman who took every register, the Machine register, and kept them in one place. But then came the wars, and now nobody knows where they are. Lebanon had archives saved by one Druze, and when he passed away, you know, you cannot tell your students where to go because nobody knows where the archives have gone. So, unlike what you're talking about, which is fantastic, suddenly the Imperial Museum is a marvel. Nobody can go through it completely. So it's all, you know, who's at fault? You don't want to pass judgment, but when you see so many sources of failure, what do you do? So the only hope is to hear it from your family.
Could we have, come up to the mic if you want to ask a question, just identify yourself.
Hello, I'm Susan Hackley, Managing Director of the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. Thank you all so much for these incredibly moving remarks. I would say I'm not going to miss Brian Williams as much as John Stewart, who really has engaged with issues relating to these wars we're currently engaged in. And I think the museums are wonderful and the stories that families need to tell. But I'd like to see images of war on a big screen in Times Square. I'd like to really do something radical. I'd like to see Harvard show large images of war. I think if we take these little baby steps, we're never going to make much of a change. And I co-led a talk in December here at Harvard with Seth Moulton. And he's a new congressman here in Massachusetts, and he's served 4 tours of duty in Iraq. I think you have to bring into these conversations the soldiers. They have a lot to tell us. It's hard for them to talk, but they want to talk. And so I'm leading a series of discussions. Why is it hard to talk about war? And I think that could make it different if you bring the soldiers into the conversations.
We certainly are all passionate about reading and writing about them, but at the same time, there are always more than one viewpoint. I mean, I remember students asking me to bring people who left the Israeli service in protest, and the debate it generated among the students, because what about those who are serving and not being as well treated by the intellectuals as those who walked away and are coming now on campuses talking about them? And the same about, take Syria today. Assad was always the bad guy, and all of a sudden now, you know, he's being portrayed as the better person than what follows. But he was a torturer of people, you know. So to bring the soldiers is one thing, but you will get a million viewpoints, not one, at least not that I can think of. So that, where is the truth? I mean, I envy those who see white and black, especially it's easier with World War II, because there were really some horrendous things happened that are known to us, or the Armenians in World War I. But a lot of the time, there are so many different viewpoints that you end up not knowing what is the truth, or do you have a right to judge? And then you have failed if you cannot make up your mind.
And there's also the danger that you think that the image or the story that people tell is horrifying, and other people find it glorifying. And I just commend, if you haven't seen it, the movie The Stuntman, which is all about how can you tell a story about war that's anti-war without glorifying it.
I want to follow up on that and ask Professor Winter about his generalization about the portrayal of war, representation of war as increasingly focused on abomination. Because I wonder if that's not the product of the circles in which we find ourselves rather than the broader culture. This enormous popularity of American Sniper that seems to have captured the public imagination, the games kids play endlessly, these war games that are very, very violent. And is there a significant bifurcation that makes your generalization more limited than I wish it were?
Let me try to make 2 points simply. I believe that the reason why George Bush and Tony Blair lied about weapons of mass destruction is that they needed something exceptional and existential in order to sell it to the public. It wasn't possible simply to say that national honor or indeed a hatred of the monstrousness of Saddam Hussein, which was just as bad as Assad, that wasn't enough. There had to be something more. There had to be something that had our, as it were, that was so compelling that simply to say we need to go to war, it wasn't enough. And I think the fact that they did lie and got caught lying has made it harder, much harder, for other leaders to do it, because public opinion, including in this country, was affected by that particular set of events, of being lied to by the president. I know we can all say, was he a bit like Henry II and so on, that would no one rid me of this, doing what the boss wanted. But my impression is not just based upon the fact that I've spent most of my life in England, where clearly Tony Blair was ruined by his lies. But it was also here, where I was after 9/11 and before the 2003, where the Mexican population, there's a huge population of undocumented migrants in New Haven. And I got involved with them. They're extraordinary people, and they too have points of view on this, like everyone else. And they were hesitant. They were much more hesitant than I thought they might be, being, from some part of Mexico that is, treats violence as an abomination already. But surely what happened in Iraq made a difference, not only why it was handled politically the way it was, but the aftermath of the leaders being exposed to the claim that they brought us to a conflict on the basis of at least false information and maybe doctored information as well. And the second point I'd like to make, and I didn't make it before, amazingly in Britain and France, a large part of this, I should have said this before to your paper, a large part of the new archives come from migrants from elsewhere who now live here, from Vietnam who live in Paris, Senegalese, Terriers Senegalais, their descendants brought their archives. It's a much more cosmopolitan sense that war is an abomination. Someone from Vietnam certainly knows about it. The African approach of people who were descendants of those who fought in the First World War is pretty clear in my view. Migration may help to mitigate what might be, shall we say, a domestic industry of violence and video games. So I'm a little more optimistic while accepting the challenge that you raise.
Is it really true, though, that the mendacity of Bush and Colin Powell and others has made it more difficult to recycle that kind of politics? It may be, but the problem does seem to me to be the failure to explain and assign culpability. It's absent completely. As the planet dissolves, and as Colin Powell's famous prediction that if you break it, you will own it, fulfills itself increasingly, we Americans do not go back and say guilt, culpability began with, on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, with a demented vice president, but competent, and a president who is a frat boy. And that the consequences of this, of the enormity of what we as Americans have done, I think so stuns us that even the man who was elected in the background of his predecessor's culpability said, we've been there, done that. We don't want to exact the penalty from them. And so we've lost for 8 years any possibility of the narrative that says we did something in 2000, whatever it was, right? No, for the election of Obama, I'm thinking that was the window that opened, and we all committed ourselves to change. And there has really been no change. It's a nice regime in that it doesn't seem to be corrupt in terms of money, say, but all the opportunities and all the live options have really been forfeited. And now we head for either a handoff of power to Republicans, for whom immigration is, of course, the centerpiece because of the circumscriptions they represent of aging and whites of a certain ethos, or to Hillary Clinton, who is redivivis Lyndon Johnson in many ways in terms of her politics.
I see 2 questions. Homie, you have one, and you have one? 3 questions. So can we maybe do each of those? Homie, you have pride of place. You
have the microphone.
You have the microphone, yes.
Two informational moments. Leila talked about the range of perspectives on any one of these things, whether visual or verbal or inscriptive. And after this panel, I would just like to let you know that we have actors from the ART representing
Very
this
nice.
kind of diversity of viewpoints. So please don't leave after the panels, just past noon. They will come and they will recite poetry, eyewitness reports from the front, and letters from Indian soldiers and various. I think you'll find this quite compelling. So I just want to mention that. You also, on the Armenian issue, which has, returned many times this morning, at the Humanities Center, we've just started an annual lecture, the Haran Dink lecture, basically funded by Armenians in the Cambridge community. And the first lecture given by Rashid Khalidi was in fact about, as I mentioned, about the First World War and the betrayal to the Armenians, the Kurds, and the Palestinians. Well, on the question of the video, you've all probably seen the video for the recruitment of soldiers now, which is very much a video game. And I refer back to Rashid Khalidi's talk, where he talks about the importance of these kinds of video games to do with war games. That is very much the diet of ISIS soldiers. In fact, his words were that they know nothing about Islam, they know a lot about video games. And I've subsequently followed this up, and it's very much a part of this, of the culture to shape one's vision through video games. But finally, Jay, I want to come to you and thank you all for this really remarkable panel, alacrity with which you accepted my invitation. I'm extraordinarily grateful, as is the center and the university. Jay, I want to come back to this notion of the museum built on a kind of principle, a structural and ethical principle of horizontality. Simply to say that, as you talked about it, it seemed as if the sum of war was death. And at some level, of course, that's right. But in a way, the sum of war is also survival, people who are maimed, people who are wounded, people who are destroyed. Do you really think that horizontality also represents that experience? Because that's a much more, even looking at it in terms of scale and space, it's a very different experience from the horizontal. I too love that Christ, the Mantegna that you showed, and of course there are other, the Christus, the veiled Christ is often in that position, the great Renaissance figure. But I do think that there are other angles of vision and other kind of bodily, corporal, and psychic indeed, positionalities other than the horizontal. And that is just a point that I wanted to raise.
I think we're going to ponder that and have the next question and see if we can get the next two questions in before we need to end.
I'm Sarah Cole, and I wanted to ask, going back, sort of we've gotten into some of the contemporary questions, so maybe following Homi a little and returning to the substance of your presentations, I was really struck by a common thread in the three presentations about continuity. I think the big story of the Great War, or World War I, is always exceptionality. The first, the thing that changed Europe, that changed the world, the levels of violence, and much of that has been talked about today and throughout the anniversary avalanche, as Jay called it. But I was very struck in each of your papers by this persistent question of the continuity of different kinds of violence before, during, and after the war. Jay, you said at one point, and I really felt everybody kind of nod in the audience, you said, did it end in 1918? And Leila, one of your opening comments, which again I thought was really sort of stopped me anyway in my tracks, was when you said, following on the keynote last night, that for Europeans it may have seemed like this was the big break with peace, but that in the part of the world you're studying, it was a continuity. It was more already exhausted by violence and the indignity of different kinds of oppression. And of course, David, your whole paper was about that. So I guess, and I've just been thinking a lot in general, in thinking about World War I and thinking about war in general as a category of experience, perhaps, of this question of the sort of ongoing, a lot of people now like to use the term perpetual, I don't know if we want that to be our term or not, but this idea that the sort of exceptional and the remarkable that is often affixed to the Great World Wars, it has to be kind of, I I don't know exactly what the right verb is, but it has to be seen in the context or perhaps even changed to think about the way in which war not just sort of historically leads to other wars, but seems somehow part of other wars and later wars and other kinds of smaller forms of violence. So I guess if there's a question, it's, I suppose, how do you, as not only historians, but incredibly important eminent historians, think about this question of exceptionality and of the kind of the shape changing of the First World War, along with or in context of the continuity of violence that you are all pointing to in these papers, and I think probably in your work more broadly.
Since I've confessed a rustiness of bibliography, I'll be quite brief, but I would like to say that the fact that many of us now speak of a 30 years war is, I think, very helpful from the point of view, intent of your question. That yes, indeed, things happened in 1914 in terms of scale and suddenness and the upending of 100 years of placidity, it seems, but it's not finished with the Wilsonian démarche and debacle. We're going to have a genocide that began in Africa, finally breaking out and being institutionalized in the Third Reich. And so it is a very long phenomenon in which from Serbia to Auschwitz, we have a linearity that we have to attend to. The question of whether it goes beyond that is a migraine that I attend right now.
Last question. Jennifer, say who you are.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Leaning from the Harvard School of Public Health. The question is brief, but as you all know, it has much behind it. There are many wars going on now, and the capacity to gather information about them is being shredded by the nature of the wars. They occur in contexts where there is not a long tradition of archival work, historians, and places that stay secure in the wars. And Leila, your point about the absence of documentation and history that is, if not accurate, at least it gives you a place to start in World War I in the Mideast. And parenthetically, there's been a lot of destruction of archives and libraries in the Mideast since then. Makes me think that we're not going to be able to understand the wars of the last 20 years, 25 years in many parts of the world. Rwanda is an exception, but it also is got a lot of focus. So the only place, this is a question, the only places where I know where we're getting work that could be comprised in an historical context are from journalists, the humanitarian agencies who keep records and write about their experiences, but also records on, what sorts of supplies were delivered. Human rights investigators who go into these war scenes before, after, sometimes during. And the International Committee of the Red Cross, which keeps its archives for 50 years. So the point I'm making is we're at hazard now of not understanding really the ordinary experience of these wars, which are affecting civilians predominantly, or of understanding the true nature of their impact and consequences. Do you agree?
I think that's an incredibly haunting comment, and I see our performers ready in the back, and I think therefore we will be haunted by it. And I invite everyone to join me in thanking this distinguished panel.
From today, Germany is at war. The Serbs started it. Austria, Hungary, Germany, Serbia, Russia, and France have joined in. We have no idea what war will be like. There are flags on all the houses in town, just as if we were having a festival. At school, my teachers say that it is our patriotic duty to stop using foreign words, and we start to learn new songs about the glory of war.
The calm expanses of the valley dotted with villages pink as roses and soft pastures. The splendid outlines of the mountains, the black lace of the pine trees, and the white lace of the eternal snows are filled with the bustling of mankind. On the fields, attacks sweep forward, wave after wave, and then come to a standstill. Houses are gutted like men, and towns like houses. Villages appear in crumpled white as though they had fallen onto the earth from the sky. Frightful loads of dead and wounded men alter the shape of the plains. You can see every country where the borders have been eaten away with massacres, constantly tearing new soldiers from its heart, full of blood, full of strength. Your gaze follows these living tributaries for the river of the dead. North, south, and west, battles rage on all sides. In the distance, you can turn this way or that. There is not a single horizon on which there is no war.
We are not youth any longer. We don't want to take the world by storm. We are fleeing. We fly from ourselves, from our life. We were 18 and had begun to love life and the world. We had to shoot it to pieces. The first bomb, the first explosion burst in our hearts. We are cut off from activity, from striving, from progress. We believe in such things no longer. We believe in the war.
Nothing but chance of death. After tearing of clothes, kept flat and watched the darkness, hearing bullets whizzing, and thought of music, and swore deep hearts, deep oaths, polite to God, and retreated, and came on again retreated, and a second time faced the screen.
Nothing but chance of death. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here.
I can no longer play with dolls. Gretel asked me what I would like to play, and I said soldiers.
I knew a man. He was my chum, but he grew blacker every day and would not brush the flies away, nor blanch, however fierce the hum of passing shells. I used to read, to rouse him, random things from dung, like get with child a mandrake root. But you can tell he was far gone, for he lay gaping, mackerel-eyed and stiff and senseless as a post, even when that old poet cried, I long to talk to some old lover's ghost. There was one thing that I might do to starve the worms. I racked my head for healthy things and quoted Maud. His grin got worse, and I could see he sneered at passion's purity. He stank so badly. Though we were great chums, I had to leave him. Then the rats ate his thumbs.
You should know that you should not, on any account, come out to the war. What more shall I write? In this you should understand the whole matter. Here it is like fire. There is no word suitable to express it. And you are intelligent. There are 50 excuses you could use. Here at the front, they slash with their knives until there is nothing of you left. Only that man comes here whose luck is bad and who has no resting place either in earth or in heaven. God is the dispenser.